my talk today is called The Paradox of Green Growth, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the changes we've got to make in thinking about the economy in order to achieve sustainability. There's going to be four main areas that I'm going to cover. Firstly, I'm going to look at the sort of ideas people are dealing with now, which are really just sort of minor fixes that are being suggested in order to carry on with the same sort of economy we've got now and just address the most serious problems. And I'm going to argue that those quick fixes actually won't work. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about whether we need to fetishise growth in the way we do and what growth has actually done for us as human societies. Then I'm going to go on and look briefly at the green stimulus that some countries have made to their economies and think why they might have done that. And then I'm going to look at other kinds of stimulus in terms of encouraging us to spend more money on consumption. And lastly, proposals aimed at the European Union. I'm sitting in the Parliament here now, and I'm going to be thinking about what we can do at that level to try and change the way our economy works. So my first data slide is about offshoring emissions, and this is data for the United Kingdom. And it compares CO2 emissions embedded in goods produced in the UK and CO2 emissions associated with goods produced overseas. And you can see that the dark block there is produced in the UK, and that volume is falling. So that's the figure that's usually reported, and the government can say our carbon dioxide emissions are falling. But if you look at the grey block there, you can see that actually the volume of that is increasing, and that's carbon dioxide embedded in goods and services that we consume that are produced outside the United Kingdom. So in other words, the only reason British carbon dioxide emissions are falling is because we're offshoring production, because we're getting goods produced from China, and when we do that, our CO2 totals appear to be falling. So it's obviously bad for our domestic economy, and it's also not doing anything for sustainability. So my next slide is just looking at energy efficiency of various economies from 1980 to some 5 years ago. And that data shows that some quite significant improvements in energy efficiency can be made in the early days of industrialisation, and you can see the dramatic falls in the energy required to produce $1 worth of output in the case of China. But when we look at the countries that have got more mature economies, we see it's actually very difficult to achieve the sort of energy reductions that we need. And in fact, the energy efficiency of production is barely increasing at all, as this graph shows. Incidentally, this graph and the following one are both taken from Tim Jackson's report, Prosperity Without Growth, that was produced for the Sustainable Development Commission a few years ago, and is full of very useful data. The next graph, also from that report, has quite a lot of complex information all tied up in one graph. And what it's demonstrating is how much carbon dioxide emissions are required to produce $1 worth of output. And if you look at the really tall block on the left there, you can see that it shows that it took 768 grams of carbon dioxide to produce $1 worth of output. Global average 2007. Now, the scenarios then project ahead, and they say, making different assumptions about the size of the population of the world and what lifestyle those people have, what sort of improvements in efficiency would be required in order for us to meet the 450 parts per million target of carbon dioxide parts per million in the atmosphere in order not to stray beyond a limit that will be dangerous in terms of climate change. And actually, if we take scenario 3, so the human population by 2050 increases to 9 billion people, and we all have an equal level of income across the world, and that income level is only at the 2007 level, so we don't assume that our standard of living will improve, then we need to be able to produce $1 worth of output with just 14 grams of carbon dioxide. That is just a massive increase in the energy efficiency of production, and one that I think is actually totally unfeasible. So in other words, if we assume we need global equality and we know that the population is going to increase, then we cannot afford to have economic growth, and in fact we need to seriously address the problem of our existing overconsumption. So that's just some points about what growth is doing and why we simply cannot continue to grow in the same way. It's simply unsustainable. But let's look at the other side of this. Let's think about what growth has actually done for us. The next slide shows what's often referred to as the Easterlin paradox. Some work by Richard Easterlin where he compared GDP per capita, so the amount of economic activity in a range of different countries, and he compared that with the subjective well-being index. So he asked people, or he used data where people had been asked, how happy are you? And he compared that data with data about the amount of activity in their economies. And you can see that the line shows, the sort of dominating line in this graph, shows that after a certain fairly low level of economic activity, people's well-being doesn't increase very much. So we don't need to have these huge incomes or vast material wealth in order to be happy. It's quite interesting that this is often called a paradox, because it's only a paradox if you assume that people are motivated by material well-being. In fact, as the Beatles said, you can't buy love, you can't buy happiness, so it's not really very surprising that you see a graph like this, but it does really put into context the constant sort of theme from politicians about the importance of economic growth. But I think the next quotation shows why this is so important to politicians, and that's because of the relationship between growth and equity. Because, as Wilson and Pickett argue here, growth is a substitute for equality of income. So as long as the economy is growing, you don't have to address this question of equality. You can just say to people, well, you may not have as much as the person next door, but you've got more than you had last year, so you should be satisfied. But once growth stops, those questions about how the limited pie that we've got is shared out become much more pressing. And that's why, on the one hand, we can't address the question of inequality without thinking about growth, but also why we will not achieve sustainability unless we address the question of inequality. So moving on to the next slide, I just wanted to address briefly this idea about jobs and growth, and why that is always focused on quantity rather than quality. I mean, here in the European Union, I'm constantly hearing this jobs and growth theme as if it was just one thing. But there's never any discussion about what sort of jobs are being created. And as you can see, San Precario on this slide is, praying for a job, but the job will not be a secure job with a pension and a decent income and sick pay. In fact, it may be a job on a 0 hours contract, because the sort of, in the post-growth economy that we're living in, where growth has effectively stopped, the sort of jobs that are being created are very low quality jobs and often very poorly paid jobs as well. So we see this emphasis here in European policy making on structural reform, which effectively means unpicking those sort of employment protections that workers have fought for over so many years, and that it's creating a downward pressure on wages and an expansion of this precarious unemployment. Another interesting perspective on current policy is the huge variation that there is in terms of the green stimulus that different governments are putting on their economies, introducing into their economies. So this graph shows that in Finland, the green stimulus, the green sectors in the economy as a result of government stimulus had increased by 54%, whereas I'm rather ashamed to say in the case of Britain, the green sectors of our economy decreased by 18%. But you can see an enormous variation here. So some European countries are really forging ahead in both moving towards renewable energy, but also stimulating the green sectors of their economy, green production. And sadly, other countries like my own are doing much better, much worse than that. And I think one of the reasons for that is demonstrated by the next slide, which is about the nature of ownership of the sustainable economy. This shows what happened to wind power electricity generation in Denmark after they introduced a feed-in tariff, but a feed-in tariff that was preferentially directed at community-owned electricity generation. What this enabled was just ordinary villagers across Denmark to set up their own wind turbines and start generating and selling their own electricity And you can see when that power was put into people's hands, they responded very rapidly, and the capacity to generate renewable electricity expanded. And since this is the transition we need to make urgently, I think it's important that we think about the way renewable technologies and sustainable technologies are owned. It's not just a technical issue, it's also a social and cultural issue. And when you give people ownership of these technologies, the expansion is very rapid. And the next slide demonstrates a similar point in terms of Germany and shows the tenfold increase in the number of energy co-ops in Germany in the past decade or so. And this is really at the heart of the German energy transition. They're making a very rapid transition to sustainable forms of energy, shutting down their nuclear generation and phasing out coal as rapidly as possible. And again, ownership, both by local authorities and by community cooperatives, is part of the explanation. Now, I'm rapidly running out of time here, so I just want to make a few points about consumption and the way consumption is driven, and whether that's actually for our benefit as human beings or whether that's for the benefit of those who live by corporate profits. So my next slide is really about whether consumption does make us happy, and I would recommend looking at the work of Max Neef here, because he makes Manfred Max Neef, the Chilean economist, barefoot economist he calls himself, he makes a very interesting point about the way a capitalist economy encourages us to confuse the need for satisfaction, so satisfiers of our desires, with actual goods that we can be sold. So, for example, if you're unhappy, in a successful society, you might go and talk to a friend about that, and that would make you feel better, or you'd go and have a drink with somebody. But now we might be encouraged to use retail therapy, so we purchase things that don't really make us feel any happier. Because I think the last point on this slide is very important as well. Because what the advertising industry is doing is creating desires, creating dissatisfaction. If your desires are satisfied, you won't carry on shopping. So it's very important that you constantly feel inadequate and dissatisfied. And often that dissatisfaction will just persist. And so this, to my mind, leads to unhappy societies and unhappy people, as well as encouraging unnecessary consumption that's putting a pressure on the planet. I just, in passing, mention this concept of cathexis because I think it's a really interesting one to investigate further. It's really about implying that you're getting certain basic desires met when actually something completely different is happening. So it's like the sort of people imagine there's a sort of human interaction going on with their gadgets now, and this is something really encouraged by Apple, which is why I use Steve Jobs as an example of this. It's suggested that you can have a sort of human relationship almost with your gadget, which substitutes for real human relationships. Again, I think a source of great mental dis-ease in our society. I'm just wanting to share with you this quotation really from an advertising executive in 1955, because I'm wanting to argue that the reason we've ended up in this society where we have to be stimulated constantly to consume is as a consequence of the last Great Depression, when it was found that if we didn't consume more than we needed, then people would end up out of work, and the failure to have sufficient demand in the economy led to unemployment. So at the time, it seemed perfectly rational and sensible to encourage people to consume more, to create things like built-in obsolescence, where goods would wear out before they needed to, so that we could have more goods produced and have more people in employment. But this way of organising the economy has now got completely out of control, and it's putting a huge pressure on our environmental systems. I just will explain this idea of the light bulb, not because I think changing light bulbs will save the world, but I think understanding the Phoebus cartel in the 1920s might help us to change the economy in a way that will help us to save the world anyway. Because the Phoebus cartel was a group of light bulb manufacturers who got together in Switzerland in 1923, I think, to say, well, look, we're not making enough money because the light bulbs we make are lasting too long. So what we have to do is create a way that after a certain number of hours, I think it was 10,000 hours, the light bulbs will blow up and people have to buy new ones. And that was, was illegal in a market system that they should do that, but they agreed, all of them, that they would have short life light bulbs, which is obviously a great waste of resources. And the light bulb you can see on the slide there is the oldest light bulb in the world, and it's in the Livermore fire station in California, and it's 110 years old, and it's still going strong. So there's no need for constantly renewing light bulbs, except if you're a light bulb manufacturer. And I think the other point I want to make here is that within a profit-driven capitalist economy, the focus is always on increasing profits rather than solving problems. So if we're going to solve the problem of sustainability, we really need to look seriously at the way our companies are focused. The shareholder-driven, profit-driven model is a real stumbling block to achieving the sorts of changes that we need. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to skip a few slides and move on to the proposals for the EU. Now, the first proposal on my slide here is the establishment of ecological enterprise zones. And what I mean by this is creating areas where you really encourage people to think totally outside the box in terms of the sorts of policies they might introduce. So you could say introduce a carbon tax in a certain economy in the European Union and just let people have positive tax breaks and allow them to move beyond some of the narrow rules that they're facing now in order to allow them to innovate. And I would suggest some of the economies that are flourishing less well at the moment and actually are not able to have growth within their economy, so they're not working on the current model anyway. Why not allow them a bit more leeway and turn them into ecological enterprise zones just to see what might happen? Because the changes we need to make are so radical, it's quite difficult to do that on a wide-scale basis, and we just need to let 1,000 flowers bloom, and this would be a way of starting that process. I'm also developing this idea of transitional investment, and this is really to check out, when people say, well, this is a green investment, how can we tell whether it's a green investment? And what I'm suggesting is you can only invest energy in, say, some piece of infrastructure in the short term if in the long term you can guarantee that that means you'll need to use less energy. So, for example, you could justify pouring the concrete to set up a wind turbine because eventually that would mean you need to use less energy and you produce less carbon emissions, but you wouldn't be able to justify an airport because that would generate more carbon emissions ultimately. So that's a way of sort of containing what we mean by the green stimulus. Another technique, similar technique, is this idea of energy return on energy invested. So investments should not be made unless they have a significant energy return. So a lot of the very difficult to reach sources of oil, for example, would say that you may be able to make them profitable, but you aren't able to make them succeed on an energy return basis because the most easy to reach sources of fossil fuel have already been exploited. And so we need to focus very much on energy returns rather than just profits when we move towards a sustainable economy. And lastly, a proposal that we're taking forward here in the Parliament right now is this idea of introducing quantitative easing to fund green infrastructure. So the European Central Bank, as other banks around the world, is effectively creating money now, but it's creating money in a way that it just feeds through the financial sector, and very little of this money comes out the other end and is actually invested in either small businesses or the green economy. So the proposal is that a certain proportion of that money needs to be created in a way that it has to be invested in green infrastructure and therefore underpin a sustainable economy of the future. Okay, that's all I have to say. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you for allowing me to participate in this rather strange way by webcam. Thank you very much.